I thought I was protecting
You
my
okay?
perfect marriage by hiding one truth.
Just
But the moment
thinking.
she finally looked at me
Thanks for the
differently,
coffee.
I realized I wasn't saving it. I was slowly destroying everything we built. The life looked almost too steady, like it had been carefully arranged to never break. Every morning began the same way, soft light slipping through the curtains, the quiet sound of movement in the kitchen, and the familiar presence that made the house feel like it was breathing. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in knowing exactly how the day would unfold without surprise or disruption. From the outside, it would have looked like a perfect marriage, a home built on understanding, shared routines, and a kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but controlled. The kind of silence that comes when two people know each other so well that words feel unnecessary. Or at least that's what it seemed like. The narrator moved through this life with a calm face, but inside there was a carefully locked compartment. Something never spoken, never referenced, never allowed to surface. It wasn't just a secret. It was a version of the past that didn't belong in this present. And so it stayed buried beneath ordinary moments. Breakfast conversations, shared chores, and quiet evenings where the television played more than either of them spoke. She was always there in a way that felt grounding. Not loud, not demanding, but present in the smallest details. The way she placed a cup on the table without sound. The way she adjusted her hair when she was thinking. The way her gaze would occasionally linger just a second longer than necessary, as if she could sense something hidden in the air between them. There were moments of closeness that felt almost too natural to question. Sitting side by side on the couch after dinner, their shoulders lightly brushing. Her hand sometimes resting near his without intention, but never quite pulling away either. These touches weren't dramatic. They were subtle, almost accidental. Yet they carried weight, as if the body understood something the words had not yet dared to say. And still, the narrator smiled through it all. Because that was what keeping peace looked like. Because the truth, if spoken, would not just change a conversation. It would fracture the entire structure of this life. So it remained unspoken, carefully buried under routine affection and carefully chosen silence. There was a strange beauty in it, though. A fragile balance between love and avoidance. Between presence and absence. Between what was shared and what was hidden. Even the air in the house seemed to hold both warmth and tension at the same time, as if the walls themselves were aware that something beneath the surface was never fully at rest. At night, when everything grew quieter, the illusion felt strongest. Sitting in the same room, close enough to feel each other's presence but distant enough not to disturb it, there was a sense that everything was fine. Almost perfect, almost unbreakable. But deep inside, the narrator knew the truth was not sleeping. It was waiting, quietly, patiently, like something alive beneath calm water, moving slowly toward the surface. At first, nothing changed on the surface. Life continued in its familiar rhythm. Same mornings, same quiet meals, same shared spaces that had become almost instinctive. But beneath that routine, something subtle had started to shift. It wasn't visible, not in any obvious way. It was felt more than seen, like a pressure in the air that had no clear source. The narrator began noticing small interruptions in the normal flow of things. A pause that lasted a second too long before answering a simple question. A glance that didn't move away as quickly as it used to. Even silence, once comfortable, started to feel like it had texture, heavier, more aware of itself. It was as if the house had begun listening back. She didn't say anything directly, but her presence felt different. When she entered a room, there was a brief stillness, like she was noticing something she couldn't yet name. Her eyes would rest on him during ordinary moments, while he poured tea, while he checked his phone, while he sat lost in thought. Not suspiciously, not angrily, but with quiet observation. As if she was slowly learning a new version of someone she already knew. Physical closeness, once effortless, began to carry a strange awareness. Sitting beside each other on the couch, there was still contact. Shoulders touching lightly, legs close enough to feel warmth, but now it lingered in awareness. A hand brushing against another didn't immediately move away as it once did. Instead, it stayed for a moment too long, uncertain whether to remain or retreat. The narrator felt it most during these small moments. The truth he carried wasn't spoken, but it seemed to echo inside him more loudly when she was near. Even something as simple as hearing her move through the room would tighten his thoughts, reminding him that silence was no longer just peace. It was maintenance. Conversations began to stretch differently, not longer in words, but in pauses. A sentence would end, and instead of flowing naturally into the next, there would be a hesitation, soft, almost invisible but present. Questions hovered at the edge of speech but never fully formed. It felt like both were standing at the same door, neither willing to open it first. At night, when the world outside grew quiet, the emotional tension became more noticeable. Sitting together in dim light, the distance between them felt smaller physically but larger emotionally. The couch, once a place of ease, now felt like a shared space of careful balance. A place where even breathing too differently could reveal something unspoken. The narrator often found himself studying her without meaning to. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when thinking. The way her fingers traced absent patterns on her cup. There was familiarity in every gesture, but also something newly unreadable, like the surface of a calm lake that might suddenly reveal depth. And beneath all of it, the hidden truth began to stir. Not breaking free yet, but no longer asleep either. It pressed against his thoughts in quiet waves, as if responding to the growing awareness between them. The more she noticed, the more it moved inside him. The more she stayed silent, the louder his own silence became. What had once been a controlled secret was starting to feel alive. Not exposed, not spoken, but breathing. It didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no raised voice, no sudden confrontation, no clear breaking point that could be pointed to and named. Instead, it arrived quietly, through something so small it almost went unnoticed. And yet, by the time the moment had passed, everything between them had already begun to shift. It started with a question that felt harmless on the surface. Something simple, spoken in the middle of an ordinary evening conversation. A memory, a detail from the past, mentioned casually as if it belonged safely in history. But for the narrator, it wasn't harmless at all. It was connected, tightly, painfully, to the truth he had kept buried. And in that instant, his entire body reacted before his mind could control it. A pause, just a fraction too long. Not silence, but something sharper. A hesitation that didn't belong in a normal exchange. The kind of pause that changes the temperature of a room without anyone moving. She noticed it, not immediately, not openly, but subtly, the way someone notices when a familiar sound suddenly feels slightly off. Her gaze lifted a little more slowly than before. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind her eyes sharpened, as if a pattern she had never questioned before had suddenly shown a missing piece. The conversation continued, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Words still existed, but they no longer carried the same ease. Each sentence now had a shadow behind it, even when they spoke about ordinary things. Food, plans, routine details. There was an invisible weight beneath the surface, as if both were aware that something had briefly slipped through the cracks. Later, when they were sitting closer, too close to ignore the presence of each other, the change became more physical. Her movements were still soft, still familiar, but slightly more intentional. When her hand rested near his on the couch, it didn't move away immediately. It stayed there, close enough that the warmth between their skin became noticeable. Not accidental anymore, not entirely unconscious. The narrator felt it deeply. That small space between contact and distance suddenly felt like a question that neither of them was ready to answer. His fingers remained still, but his awareness of her presence intensified in a way that made even breathing feel deliberate. She didn't accuse him, not yet, but the way she looked at him had changed. It was no longer just comfort or familiarity, it was observation. As if she was trying to understand a version of him she had never fully seen before, even after all this time. And that was the crack. Not anger, not discovery, just awareness. The realization that something didn't fully align anymore. That night, silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was alert, the kind of silence that listens. The narrator lay awake longer than usual, replaying the moment in his mind. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was small enough to be dangerous. He understood, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to before, that secrets don't always break lives with explosions. Sometimes they do it with hesitation. And somewhere between that paused question and her lingering gaze, the perfect illusion had already begun to fracture. Quietly, irreversibly, and without permission. After the first crack, nothing returned to the way it was. Even though the days still followed their familiar pattern, something inside those patterns had changed. The rhythm of their life continued, but it no longer felt effortless. Every moment now seemed slightly aware of itself, like a performance where both people had started noticing the stage lights. The narrator tried to act normal. That was the first instinct: restore balance, smooth over the tension, return everything to how it used to be. But the truth doesn't respond to effort like that. It doesn't retreat just because it is ignored. Instead, it presses forward quietly, showing itself in fragments. It came in the form of memories. Not full recollections at first, just flashes. A sound that triggered a forgotten moment. A phrase that reopened something carefully locked away. A passing detail that suddenly felt connected to something much larger than it should have. Each memory arrived uninvited, breaking through the present like a crack forming under pressure. And with every fragment that surfaced in his mind, the narrator's emotional control became harder to maintain. There were moments during the day when his expression would tighten for no visible reason. Moments when he would stop mid-action, as if something invisible had interrupted his thoughts. She noticed these changes more clearly now, not as suspicion, but as quiet recognition that something internal was no longer stable. Her presence became more attentive, not intrusive, but deeply observant. When they spoke, her responses slowed slightly, as if she was listening not only to words but to the spaces between them. When they sat together, the distance between them felt carefully measured, neither increasing nor closing fully, but existing in a delicate in-between state. One evening, they found themselves sitting in the same room longer than usual. The light was dim, soft enough to blur edges and soften expressions. The television played quietly in the background, but neither of them was really watching. Instead, there was a shared stillness that felt heavier than silence alone. Her hand rested near his again. This time, there was no accidental quality to it. It was deliberate in its calmness, as if presence itself had become a form of communication. The narrator noticed how aware he was of that small proximity, how even a slight movement of her fingers could shift the emotional atmosphere. He wanted to speak. Several times, words rose to the surface of his thoughts, but none of them formed correctly. Each sentence felt too fragile, too dangerous, too incomplete. So they stayed inside, adding pressure instead of release. She finally spoke, not directly about the truth, but around it. A question shaped carefully, without accusation. Her voice was calm, but underneath it was something steady and unmistakably serious. She wasn't asking out of curiosity anymore. She was asking because avoidance had stopped being an option. The narrator felt the shift immediately. This was no longer about subtle tension or unspoken discomfort. This was the moment where silence itself began to lose authority. The truth was no longer contained within him. It was beginning to respond outwardly, shaping the way she looked at him, the way she waited for answers, the way the room itself seemed to hold its breath. And in that shared stillness, he understood something clearly for the first time. The truth was no longer only inside him. It was between them now. It didn't happen in a place meant for conflict. There were no raised voices, no dramatic setting, no interruption from the outside world. Instead, it unfolded in the kind of space that usually feels safe, the quiet of an ordinary room at night, where the light is soft and the world outside feels far away. The atmosphere had changed long before either of them spoke. It was in the way they moved slower around each other, as if careful not to disturb something fragile in the air. Even sitting down felt intentional now. The distance between them on the couch was small, but it carried meaning it never used to hold. Every second of silence felt stretched, like it was waiting for something to finally give. She was the one who broke it, but not suddenly. Her voice came gently, controlled, almost careful. There was no anger in it, only clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives after too much silence has been endured. She didn't ask directly at first. She circled the truth, speaking in a way that made it impossible to avoid what the conversation was really about. The narrator felt it immediately in his chest, that tightening sensation that comes when avoidance is no longer an option. His hands stayed still, but inside, everything shifted. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides, narrowing the space between thought and speech until it became almost unbearable. For a moment, he didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because the truth suddenly felt too large to fit into words. Every version of it he had rehearsed in his mind collapsed the moment he tried to bring it forward. It wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a history, a consequence, something that had been shaping their life without permission. She waited, not impatiently but firmly. Her presence didn't move away. She stayed close enough that the silence between them felt shared rather than separate. And in that shared silence, something shifted, because now it wasn't just about what was being hidden. It was about whether honesty could still exist between them at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than expected. Not broken, not dramatic, just controlled, careful, and uncertain at the edges. The truth came out in pieces rather than a single confession, as if even speaking it required hesitation. Each sentence felt like it changed the air slightly, making the room feel different than it was a moment before. As he spoke, he noticed her reaction not in movement, but in stillness. Her expression didn't collapse or explode. It tightened subtly, as if every word was being absorbed and measured against everything she had believed until now. Her eyes didn't leave him, but something inside them shifted, like recognition meeting disbelief in the same space. At one point, there was a pause where neither of them spoke again. That pause felt heavier than anything before it. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not resolution, not forgiveness, but understanding that things could not remain the same after this moment. Her hand moved slightly, then stopped. It hovered near his for a brief second before settling into stillness again. That small, incomplete gesture said more than words could. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't acceptance. It was the emotional space between both, uncertain, human, exposed. And the narrator realized, sitting there in that quiet room, that the confrontation wasn't just about revealing truth. It was about discovering what remained of love once the illusion was gone. After the truth finally left his mouth, the room didn't immediately react. There was no dramatic silence that followed. Only a quieter, deeper kind of stillness, as if the air itself had thickened. Everything felt paused, but not peaceful. It felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath to see what would break first. She didn't respond right away. Her expression remained steady for a few seconds, but something inside it had already shifted. It wasn't anger that surfaced first. It was disbelief layered with pain so controlled it almost looked like calm. Her eyes stayed on him, as if searching for something that could explain what she had just heard in a way that wouldn't change everything. But there was nothing left to reinterpret. The truth had fully arrived now, and it filled the space between them without permission. The narrator felt it immediately, not just in her reaction but in himself. The moment the words were spoken, something inside him loosened and collapsed at the same time. The tension he had carried for so long didn't disappear gently. It broke apart in fragments, leaving behind a strange emptiness. His breathing felt uneven, like his body was adjusting to a reality that no longer had anything to hide behind. She finally moved, but only slightly. A shift in posture, a subtle repositioning that created distance without physically leaving. That small movement carried more weight than any reaction could have. It was not rejection in the loud sense. It was recognition that something fundamental had changed, and could not simply be undone by remaining close. The narrator noticed everything now with heightened awareness. The way her fingers tightened briefly before relaxing. The way her gaze lowered for a moment before returning. The way her silence had changed tone. It was no longer the silence of listening. It was the silence of processing something that had no easy emotional shape. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer than before, but also more distant. Not emotionally cold, just carefully restrained, as if she was holding herself together with effort. Her words were not accusations. They were questions that didn't expect easy answers anymore. Questions shaped by disappointment, confusion, and the quiet shock of realizing that a shared reality had been partially constructed on something unspoken. Each word from her made the narrator feel the weight of his choice more clearly. Not in a dramatic way, but in a deeply personal one. the kind of weight that settles into memory rather than sound. He tried to respond, but what came out felt inadequate, fragmented, unable to repair what had already shifted. At one point, their eyes met fully again. That moment carried a strange intensity. Not anger, not resolution, but exposure. Two people looking at each other after the structure they trusted had stopped feeling stable. In that gaze, there was still recognition of who they were to each other, but now it was layered with something new. The awareness that they might not be able to remain those people in the same way. A quiet physical moment followed without intention. His hand moved slightly toward hers. Not to claim, not to hold tightly, but instinctively, as if seeking grounding. Her reaction was not to pull away immediately. Instead, her hand remained still for a second too long before slowly shifting out of alignment, not rejecting him entirely, but breaking the continuity of closeness. That small interruption said everything. The emotional collapse wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It unfolded in micro-moments. Breathing that didn't match, silence that felt heavier than speech, proximity that no longer guaranteed connection. And in that stillness, the narrator understood something irreversible. The truth had not just been revealed. It had changed the shape of everything they were. Morning arrived without asking for permission, as it always did. Soft light entered the room through the curtains, touching everything with the same gentle honesty that no longer felt comforting. The world outside continued normally. Distant sounds of life, routine movement, time refusing to pause for what had happened the night before. Inside the house, everything felt slightly unfamiliar. There was no dramatic separation, no final words that ended everything cleanly. Instead, there was space. A quiet, uncertain space where two people existed in the same home but no longer moved with the same emotional rhythm. The silence between them was no longer protective. It was exposed. The narrator found himself awake earlier than usual, sitting in a place that had once felt ordinary. Same chair, same room, same view, but now carried a different emotional weight. Every object felt unchanged, yet somehow redefined. Even the smallest sounds, the shift of fabric, the distant hum of life outside, felt amplified in the absence of emotional certainty. She was there too, not distant in location, but in presence. Moving through the space quietly, carefully, as if each action had to be measured again. There was no hostility in her movements, no visible breakdown. Instead, there was a composed stillness that felt heavier than emotion itself. The kind of stillness that comes after something has been fully understood, even if it hasn't been fully accepted. At one point, their eyes met across the room. It lasted only a moment, but it carried everything that had been spoken and everything that no longer needed to be. There was no return to ignorance in that gaze. Only recognition. Two people who had once shared a version of life that no longer fully existed. And yet, something remained. Not the same love they had before. Not untouched, not innocent, but something quieter and more human. Something that had survived the breaking without pretending it hadn't been broken. Later, they sat together without speaking much. The distance between them was no longer about physical space. It was emotional recalibration, learning how to exist in the same moment without relying on old versions of closeness. Their shoulders were near enough to feel presence, but not close enough to assume comfort. Still, neither of them moved away. Her hand rested near his for a brief moment, not reaching, not holding, just existing in shared space. This time, there was no tension in the gesture. Only acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that not everything has to be repaired to still be real. The narrator didn't try to fix what had happened anymore. That need had slowly dissolved, replaced by something more grounded. Acceptance of consequence. The truth had already done what it was going to do. Now all that remained was how to carry it. She finally spoke a few words, simple, measured, without emotional performance. Not forgiveness, not closure, but honesty in its purest form. The kind that doesn't erase pain, but refuses to let it become the only thing that defines the connection between two people. There was no promise of what came next, no clear direction, only a shared recognition that the life they had known had changed shape, and neither of them could return to the exact place they came from. And still, as the day continued, something quiet remained between them. Not illusion, not perfection, but truth imperfect, fractured, and undeniably human. A truth that no longer tried to hide itself, and a connection that, even in its brokenness, still existed in the simplest form. Two people learning how to be real with what is left.